Wolff, in the second part of this interview, I want to talk about a book that you are arguably most famous for, the academic study entitled Inventing Eastern Europe, the Map of Civilization on the Mind of the Enlightenment. Now, I want to ask you the same question I asked in the first part of the interview, which is, how did you come to write this book? Because there's a very nice little anecdote fairly early on in the book where you talk about how you were working, I think it was in the 1980s, in the Vatican Secret Archive, and he came across a set of letters by Giovanni Archetti, who was a nuntius, which is kind of an ambassador or permanent representative of the Pope in another country. And Archetti was writing to the Pope because Archetti was about to set off to the court of Catherine the Great of Russia. Tell me about that little story that you discuss in the book.
He was attempting to negotiate a religious settlement in relation to the new Catholic populations of the Russian Empire in the period of the Polish partitions. That is to say, there were Polish lands that were annexed by the Russian Empire, and therefore the Roman Catholic Church had new interests in the Russian Empire in the late 18th century. And Archetti felt that in order to gratify Catherine, he would need to follow courtly procedure and kiss her hand. And he was concerned that the Pope would not approve of his doing that because that it might seem to acknowledge the precedence of a secular ruler and a woman in particular. And he was concerned about how that would be received in Rome. So he made out he wrote out a whole special plea for permission to kiss Catherine's hand upon being presented to her in St. Petersburg, and it centered on the question of trying to explain to the Pope, who was a southern statesman based in Rome, the different and more backward manners of northern countries like Poland and Russia. That is to say, Archetti had been the nuncio in Warsaw and was therefore a presumed expert on northern countries like Poland, which made him also an expert on northern countries like Russia, and someone who knew how to gratify them people there by playing to what Italians understood to be their more backward systems of manners. And this was fascinating to me. This emerged from my doctoral dissertation research and from a project that preceded Inventing Eastern Europe. Interesting to me that as late as the 1780s, for Archetti, Europe was still divided into South and North. When he thought about going to Russia, he didn't think of himself as traveling to Eastern Europe. He thought of himself as traveling within Northern Europe from Poland.
There is an ironic thing, or actually two ironic things about that particular correspondence between Archetti and the Pope, as you point out in your book. First of all, that they should be worried about this kind of thing in the decade that would produce the French Revolution, where the whole old world order disappears, and they are discussing, can I kiss the hand of Catherine the Great or not? And of course, the other irony that you also point to is that already in Catherine the Great's own lifetime, her sexual excesses were a bit of a legend. So, kissing Catherine's hand was not a particularly unusual thing to do for soldiers and diplomats and so on. But of course, the important thing here is, as you say, that Archetti, as a representative of the Roman Catholic Church, kind of still holds on to what is the Renaissance view of Europe, where Europe is divided in two parts, but the parts are the southern nations, which are genteel, sophisticated, developed, and so on, and the northern countries, including Russia and Poland and so on, which are seen as unsophisticated, undeveloped, or certainly underdeveloped, and basically barbaric. And so Archetti's perspective is an old-fashioned one, because it is precisely that geographical perspective that shifts, that changes in the age of Enlightenment. Isn't that right?
That's exactly how I understood the problem. If you go back to the Renaissance, to a period when culture is being defined from Rome, Florence, and Venice, the understanding of Europe is one still divided between a advanced Mediterranean south and a backwards transalpine north, with the Alps as the formidable and, markable geographical division between South and North. What's interesting to me is that over the course of the 18th century, our modern sense of Europe divided into an East and a West emerges. A Europe which is defined from new cultural and economic centers, defined from Paris, London, and Amsterdam, as the Western perspectives that produce a new Eastern Europe, so that suddenly Poland and Russia, which had been northern countries up until the 18th century, are suddenly being reconceived as Eastern countries. It's all a matter of perspective, right? Because obviously every place is north, south, east, or west of someplace else. It's a question of which perspective is defining the continent.
And that is precisely the title of your book, isn't it? Inventing Eastern Europe,
yes,
as something that happened as a geographical shift that happened during the Enlightenment. But then, equally importantly, it's not just a geographical shift, but it's also actually an epistemological shift. Can you explain how it is an epistemological shift? First of all, maybe in sort of conceptual, theoretical terms, and then we look at one or two examples. So the geographical reorientation, south-north becomes west-east, but with that goes a certain gaze, a certain way
yes,
of looking at Eastern Europe. So it's not just, again, geographical, it's epistemological. It's a new way of not just of looking at countries, but a new way of interpreting these countries, and in that sense a new way of generating knowledge.
So it coincides with the coining of the term civilization in the 18th century. It's a brand new, it's a neologism in the 18th century, both in French and in English, civilization and civilisation. And that becomes the conceptual focus for thinking about a new ordering of Europe in terms of what is more or less civilized, and that is what's imposed on this new mental mapping of Europe from west to east, in which the West takes the measure of the continent with respect to its own presumed civilization, imposing hierarchical divisions upon the rest of Europe as it looks to the east, so that Eastern Europe can emerge as the complementary, less civilized other half of a presumed to be more civilized Western Europe. That is to say, it's Western Europe not only inventing Eastern Europe, but inventing itself as Western Europe. This is closely connected to Foucault's ideas about the ways in which knowledge produce power epistemologically, but also closely connected to Edward Said's ideas about the West's relation to the Orient. I understand the relationship of Western Europe to Eastern Europe being one of demi-Orientalism, a term that I think I coined in that book, for understanding a relation to some place, Eastern Europe, which is not absolutely other with a capital O, as Said would say for the West's relation to the Orient, but which is both of Europe and not of Europe at the same time. It's the ambiguous status of Eastern Europe that makes this into a demi-Orientalism.
It's a kind of half Europe, and many years later, I think it's about 1878, 1880 something, I can't remember exactly, Karl Emil Franzos wrote a book which was called Aus halb Asien. So this is half Europe, half Asia. And that new geographical gaze then, in, as you say, in a kind of Orientalist or semi-Orientalist fashion, then produces the East as a kind of barbaric other, I suppose, which is partly similar, partly dissimilar to the West. So it's both the constitution of the other and a kind of self-constitution as well. Because if you say the others are this, and this, then it means that you yourself, you tend to be sort of the positive side of that.
These are barbarians who are not absolutely barbaric, right? These are barbarians who exist on a scale that moves from barbarism to civilization, so that they're all redeemable. Right, the key to Voltaire's infatuation, first with the legend of Peter the Great, and then with Catherine, is the idea that they are the people who are capable of civilizing Russia.
Yeah. That brings us to the Enlightenment's idea of a mission civilisatrice that we'll explore in a moment. Let's look first at some of these, I suppose, ideologies, to use Frederick Jameson's term. So some of the motifs that are central to this orientalizing or semi or demi-orientalizing view of Eastern Europe. They are to do with sexuality, with slavery, I think, and with corporal punishment. Perhaps the easiest way into that is by looking at an example, and I think a good example is one that you discuss extensively, Casanovas' memoirs, which I think were not published but written between something like 1790 and 1798. The memoir is called Histoire de ma vie. Talk a little bit about how Casanovas' memoirs are representative of that both geographical and above all epistemological shift that takes place during the Enlightenment.
Casanova travels all over Europe. The memoirs, of course, have one very prominent theme, which are his libertine relations with women all over the continent of Europe. And what interested me most in this case were his Eastern travels, which he still understands in many ways to be Northern travels, because remember, Casanova is an Italian, right? He preserves the Italians are the last ones to give up the idea
still the
of
Giovanni
South and
Archetti
North.
perspective to some degree.
And what I describe in the book is Casanova's excitement at the idea that in Russia he's free to purchase a young girl as a sexual slave. I think in the book I give her age as 13, although I've recently gone through the memoirs and wondered whether she's actually 12 at the time that he purchases her. But she's very young, and one of the things that's exciting for him is the idea that serfdom, as practiced in Russia, makes it possible for him to take advantage of the social system in order to own a young girl, to own her sexually, and then to begin to transform her, and in a certain sense begin to civilize her as his own possession.
Yeah. The first step in that direction, as he sees it anyway, is arguably when he gives her a name, and he gives her the name Zaire. Why that particular name?
It comes from Voltaire. It's one of the Voltaire dramas from earlier in the 18th century, and it's a harem drama. It's about the it's a drama of the Orient, and one in which the possession of a girl in the Orient is exactly what he's trying to replicate in Russia, right? Understanding it's the Eastern connection here between the world of the Middle East and the world of Russia that he's encountering in the 18th century.
Yeah, so
Voltaire, I believe, sets Zaire in the age of the Crusades,
yes.
Whereas Casanova is obviously functioning in contemporary Europe, but he's making an equation between the world of the Eastern Mediterranean and the world of Russia.
Yeah. And there's a specific, I think you bring that out well in the book, there's a specific sort of unconscious function as well, because Casanova, when he's traveling Italy and France and so on, there are all these women that he's trying to seduce. Here, there's no need for seduction because he can just buy the girl who's a slave. So in Russia, in the East, you have stuff such as prostitution and sexual slavery and brothels and so on. But of course, all that's a bit sort of grubby. So instead of presenting it as that, which is what it is, he purchases a slave. He then kind of dresses it up, and Zaire, calling it Zaire is the first step, he kind of dresses it up by, giving it the feeling of an Oriental harem. So instead of the grubbiness of prostitution and sexual slavery, you then have the eroticism of the harem, which then gives the man a much better feeling. How does he, because he also explicitly tries to civilize her, does he not? How does he do that?
He dresses her differently. He believes that he can teach her manners. He attempts to present her, a girl from a serf family, in some of the society in which he circulates in Russia, and he sees himself as, you know, transforming her, right, into a European, right, is what is.
It's a wonderful metaphor in a sense, almost like a mise en abîme, where he's doing all sort of bad things to the girl. He is sexually exploiting her, but then he's dressing that up also for himself, and unconsciously as what I'm really doing is civilizing her. So it's really colonialism, but they're dressed up in the language, in the belief that we're actually doing something good for these people.
I think that's right.
We are civilizing them.
And when he leaves Russia, he passes her on to another foreigner as a young woman whom he feels is now more valuable than she was when he first acquired her from her family upon his arrival in Russia. Yeah. I should say that just to connect this back to the other discussion of child abuse, that Casanova was very important in the later project that I did on child abuse in Casanova's Venice, and I went through the memoirs very carefully, asking the question that nobody had ever asked before, which was, how young is too young for Casanova? And the answer is that Casanova pretty indiscriminately is interested in women down to the ages of 12 and 11. And the really, you know, sharp distinction that we might try to make about the sexual exploitation of minors are ones that he does not make in his memoirs. But clearly the Russian circumstances allow him greater freedom to play. Yeah. That is to say, to intervene in families where otherwise parents might be more protective of their children, but the serf system in Russia gives him more freedom to insert himself into those social relations.
He also gives a rather odd and actually quite shocking explanation as to why Zaire loves him and is still with him, which is that he beats her from time to time.
Yep.
And then the idea is that here in Russia, that's kind of what's needed, and then he even links that to the political system, does he not?
Mm-hmm. And he was not the only one who have linked it to the political system, right? It was understood to be a political system based on corporal punishment, in which corporal punishment plays a large role in criminal justice, and there's even a kind of pornography of imagery connected to beating in Russia in the 18th century that circulates in publications, publications that occur in France, beginning in the second half of the 18th century, and culminating, we could say, in the pornography of the Marquis de Sade, which takes us eventually to the court of Catherine the Great in Juliet.
Yeah, yeah. You talked about what is basically pedophilia, how young these girls were. Interestingly enough, then we think of, so first of all, we think of Casanova as the great seducer, and when he's in Italy and France, very often he describes the voluptuous women of the voluptuous forms of the women that he then seduces. Obviously, very different with Zaire, who basically has the body of a boy because she's so young. But then Casanova also has, and he probably gave himself the liberty, because after all this is Russia, you know, they do things differently, and he gives himself the liberty of a homosexual encounter with a young Russian officer who looks a bit like a woman or a girl.
Uh-huh. One of the things that I thought was interesting about travelers in Eastern Europe in the 18th century, Western travelers, is that they allow themselves to reinvent themselves a little bit in the altered circumstances, social circumstances of Eastern Europe. And that would be true of Casanova as well, who experiments a little bit with his own sexuality in Russia. It's his great subject. The other case that I usually talk about for this is Mozart, who, traveling between Vienna and Prague, which is actually a Western trip, not an Eastern trip, but he experiences it as an Eastern trip by his ear as he begins to hear the Czech language, traveling from Vienna to Prague, and he makes up new names for himself and for all of his family and friends. This is I am Punky TTT. He writes about it in one of his letters. But it's the idea that when you're in a new language realm, you acquire a new identity to match that new realm. In this case, the Czech realm of Slavic language.
Yeah. We see similar elements, similar ideologies, similar motifs in the travels of Baron Münchhausen. So this was a book that was published first in English translation in 1785, then was translated back into German by Gottfried August Berger in 1786. It has a wonderful long German title, which is Wunderbare Reisen zu Wasser und zu Felde, Feldzüge und lustige Abenteuer des Freiherrn von Münchhausen. And I think it gives a really fascinating interpretation there of Münchhausen's encounters with various wolves and bears and foxes. And again, they're bringing out the really epistemological relevance of these passages. Talk to me about that.
So you mentioned to me that you had read these as a kid, and I read them as a kid as well. And one of the things that one is struck by is is supposed to be struck by, are the extravagance of his imagination in recounting his wild and extreme adventures, often involving encounters with wild animals, for instance. And to me, what was striking when I went back and looked at them is the terrain on which those adventures play out, which is Eastern European terrain. That is to say, it's as if he allows his Munchausian fantasies to go crazy when he's on this fantasy terrain of Eastern Europe, as if that's the space where anything could happen in Eastern Europe, where you could engage with the violence of wolves and bears in a direct and immediate way.
And there's a strong sort of sadistic sexual aspect to those encounters as well, isn't there?
Yep, yeah, there absolutely is, right? There's a certain amount of, rape with the handle of a whip.
Where the sun doesn't shine, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
But the use of the lash is for him very important as well, as he makes his way through Poland and Russia.
Which is very similar to the kind of stuff that Casanova does,
yep.
and that, of course, as you said, you also see in the Sade, Histoire de Juliette. Now,
but this idea of, and as in Juliette, right, where it's the fantasy play of the orgy that becomes even more exciting for Sade in the Russian context, although we know it's exciting for him everywhere. For Munchausen, right, the adventures, right, become more exciting in his fantasy. And I came to see Eastern Europe more generally as a site for certain kinds of fantasy play for the Enlightenment. I mean, not just sexual or travel fantasy, but political fantasy as well.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a good aspect now to take the second step, because we're not just looking at epistemology, but also at power. At power, epistemology arguably is always power. Bacon, towards the end of the 16th century, already famously said knowledge itself is power. So from an Enlightenment perspective, or from the perspective of a certain Enlightenment, there is this mission that we, or Western Europeans, have to civilize other countries, the mission civilisatrice. There's this famous quotation by Georges Danton, that the hirelings of despotism must be vanquished by the exterminating angel of liberty. L'ange exterminateur de la liberté fait tomber des satellites du despotisme. That is sort of the idea. And you can see that very clearly, and you analyze that in your book, in Voltaire's letters to Catherine. So, to Catherine the Great. Talk to us a little bit about what Voltaire is saying in these letters.
Voltaire, in his letters to Catherine, as we see earlier in Voltaire's writings about Peter, is deeply invested in fantasies of civilization, being brought to Eastern Europe, in this case to Russia, but not only Russia, right? He sees both Peter and Catherine as champions and rulers over a more broadly imagined East that includes the lands of the Ottoman Empire, and he sees them as the figures who will bring Western civilization to those Eastern lands. And it's a fantasy of enlightened absolutism in its most extreme form because Voltaire's fascination with Russia is not because he believes Russia is advanced and enlightened, but rather the reverse, because he believes it's supremely backwards, and therefore it's the ultimate test of that civilizing mission would be whether someone could be powerful, enlightened, and strong enough to civilize even Russia. Hence Peter, hence Catherine.
And the interesting thing is that although this is an Enlightenment perspective, it's less about convincing and persuading, but it's actually what Voltaire was saying, we need a really strong hand here. And therefore also his admiration for Peter the Great and for Catherine the Great, even though they were actually, doing quite problematic, quite violent things.
Voltaire is Catherine's biggest fan, writes to her throughout the Turkish wars, cheering for her armies and promising that he will come and visit her when she has conquered Constantinople. She has been urging him to come and visit her in St. Petersburg, which Voltaire, declines to do. He makes up excuses why he would be too old or too infirm to travel to the north. But there's an ongoing epistolary flirtation between the two of them over the possibility of an encounter that never takes place. All of his books are in St. Petersburg to this day. When I wanted to consult Voltaire's library, I had to go to St. Petersburg. She waited until his death and then bought his entire estate and had all of his books moved to St. Petersburg, where they're in the public library to this day.
Final question. Let us very briefly look at the repercussions of the invention of Eastern Europe and this sort of Orientalism or semi-Orientalism, Orientalizing view of Eastern Europe. Let's look at the repercussions and reverberations of that into the modern world, because it didn't stop with the Enlightenment. On the contrary, then it continued on, and it continues on even until today.
So I published this book in 1994. These are the issues that were totally on my mind as the Cold War was ending, right, between 1989 and 1991. That is to say, my whole early life was shaped by the Cold War convention that, of course, Europe was divided into a Western Europe and an Eastern Europe. It wasn't until the moment that the Cold War was ending that I think really anyone started to think about what those categories really meant and whether they were really essential categories at all, or whether they were products of very particular geopolitical and cultural circumstances. So the end of the Cold War was the moment at which it began to be possible to put quotation marks around Eastern Europe and Western Europe and wonder whether it would be possible to evade, right, that kind of binary opposition between halves of the continent. And sure enough, right, the 90s, the first few years of the 21st century, was about what seemed to be a new integration of Europe. That is to say, the moment in 2004 of European enlargement, of EU enlargement, and then 2007. 2004 is Poland, the Czech Republic, the Baltic countries, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, all into the EU. In 2007 is Romania and Bulgaria. Europe no longer looks like Cold War Europe, right, when you look at a map of Europe in 2007, then Croatia in 2013. The question would be, I came to the conclusion that the idea of a Europe divided in people's minds was much older than the Cold War. So the question is, does a Europe divided in people's minds also continue after the Cold War and in spite of your EU enlargement? And a lot of the controversy surrounding free movement, and immigration following 2004 and 2007, I think makes pretty clear that those kinds of barriers do still exist in people's minds.
Yeah, if you come to the UK, to talking about the UK, so Dutch people, German people, French people, they come to the UK to work. But people from Poland and Romania and Bulgaria and so on, they largely come here to make use of the National Health Service and so on. So these old prejudices still persist.
Mm-hmm. And the figure of, say, the Polish plumber or the plombier polonais in French, became a turning point figure at the time of the EU constitutional referendum in France in 2005. And I think in some sense, represents, the beginning of the emergence of what we now recognize as a climate of contemporary Euroscepticism, right? Crystallizing around that figure, quasi-mythological figure of the plombier polonais. And that, I think, attaches to a little bit to that older, well, more than a little bit, to that older sense of civilizational difference between West and East, and an ongoing resentment, sense of superiority, sense of difference and distinction between
Because
East
there are quite
and
a
West.
lot of people from Eastern Europe who work here as professors, as doctors, as nurses and so on, but Eastern European and especially Polish, it's the Polish plumber. So as the underdeveloped person coming to, to benefit from our sort of civilization. And you've got the same perspective, or this is a question rather, seems to me you've got the same perspective when we talk about Poland and how Poland seems to be backsliding more into a sort of a much more conservative politics, or we talk about Hungary. And those politics and policies in Poland and Hungary are then seen as signs of enormous backwardness, which is typical of those nations. Whereas, of course, we see the same thing happening in Holland, in Italy, in America, in Britain, and so on. But for us, it's not a sign of backwardness. But in the case of, say, Hungary or Poland, it is.
I mean, I was totally demoralized for a long time by the emergence of such a strong climate of Euroscepticism in Eastern Europe, because for a long time it seemed to me that all anyone wanted in Eastern Europe was to be part of Europe, that it would be the ultimate vindication, that it would really mean that the Cold War was definitively over. And the emergence of that climate of Euroscepticism, which is notably strong in Hungary and Poland, was distressing to me, and something I would never have predicted. I've come to feel, and again, I don't feel good about this, but I've come to feel that in some ways it's the mark of the new normal. That is to say, in some sense, the strong climate of Euroscepticism inside of East European countries is the mark that they really are part of Europe, because that Euroscepticism is present throughout Europe at the present moment.
I think that's a very good note to end on. There, Wolff, thank you very much for doing this interview.
Thank you, Henk.